kind of performative action here. So if you need to step out early, please be careful not to slam the door and do it gently, okay? And Larry's going to be reading from Vampire Lectures, which is a recent publication, and acting out. Also, I should just mention that he's coming out with a trilogy of books in Nazi psychoanalysis, which you may want to actually introduce before you start reading. What do you think? Yep, okay. All right, please welcome Larry.
Thank you for inviting me to present my 2 recent publications. This will be the last time I will have done this on the West Coast, and that's why the virtualness of it is welcome. In just a week, I'll be in New York City reading at a club called Mother that has Vampires Night on Thursdays. So, and that will be the true end of this reading campaign. I'm not going to introduce the upcoming work, Nazi Psychoanalysis, because what I read from this collection, Acting Out in Groups, sort of anticipates some of the problems that I look at greater length in that study that will be appearing also with Minnesota Press in the fall. Okay, so the last thing I should mention for those of you who don't know is that this is a lecture book that is kind of a ready-made that sort of fell into my lap. It's based on student tapings of my lectures over the years in this course that when I last taught it attracted 1,000 students. And so I have a documentary tape that's going to accompany the reading so you can see, catch this book where it bred. Perception. ENDO, psychic perception. Now, an endopsychic perception, according to Freud, is one that, no matter how delusional it may be on the outside, is actually giving a correct view on the inside of how our psyche works, of how what Freud himself called the psychic in psychosis. We've done a kind of family setting. What is a historical fact? It is after the fact. With vampirism, in any event, history comes after to give definition to an unformed body of symptoms. If one could scan on rewind the facts and rumors circulating as vampirism at any given time or over time in real time, what we would find before us is the polymorphous confusion of activities and desires that go down and out and under the name of vampirism. There are many, many ways in which one can become a vampire, many ways in which one can exercise one's vampirism, and there are many different parts of the body where the blood can be sucked. But there are also histories of vampirism. The most prominent history is the one Bram Stoker ended up with in the course of writing Dracula. He worked the archives at the British Museum to open a coherent historical account of vampirism to back his novel. But up front, in his own real time zone, Stoker wrote a spy novel about female sexuality and group psychology that is more about the vampire being replaced by us than it is, over time, about the ongoing history of vampirism. In our time, Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles opens another account. Like Stoker's double take, Rice's chronic approach works both time zones at once. It is an account of the vampire, the legend, over time. But it also draws from the joint account vampirism opens up here, now, and always between self and other. The vampire is us. We have a history, but we don't want to be history, because now we know, with Rice, what it is like to be the vampire and that we like the vampire. We would like to be different, like the vampire we'd like to be like. In medieval Europe, at the time of the Middle Ages crisis, a working definition of vampirism was already current, the one, you know the one, that the Christian church came up with to put down sinners.
This medieval take first fixed the focus on the vampire. The vampire was by definition a dead person who, since not eligible for proper Christian burial in hallowed ground, was on the rebound. And finally, for there are 4 coherent but largely non-superimposable histories of vampirism, there was the one developed in the 18th century. That was the time when professors at German and French universities began addressing an outbreak of vampirism cited back east and reported in the newspapers and journals out west. I remember when The Return of the Living Dead was first released. The sales pitch and motto was, "Just when you thought it was safe to be dead." That is the uncanny threat to afterlife that got the attention of the Western Europeans, now faced with the undead epidemic taking over Eastern Europe. The period of publication of Countess Báthory's murders at the end of the 17th century, the family had done time trying to conceal the records, converged with the onset of this turn of the 18th century vampirism epidemic. This, the first manifestation of vampirism to make it into the virtual real time of legal, medical, military information gathering, supplied our only evidence that vampirism might be a happening sort of thing that can be witnessed and investigated on location. In its 1693 issue, the French journal Mercure Galant gave the epidemic the kind of coverage it needed to spread. The vampires appeared after lunch and stayed until midnight, sucking the blood of people and cattle in great abundance. They sucked through the mouth, the nose, but mainly through the ears. They say that the vampires had a sort of hunger that made them chew even their shrouds in the grave. That is why, during the first half of the 18th century, there was a matching upsurge of scholarly interest in vampirism, which thus coincided with the foundation of the modern university. There were, beginning around 1728 and in the course of maybe 15 years, as many as 40 treatises on vampirism researched and published at German and French universities. These scholars had not witnessed vampirism, but were reporting in scholarly fashion to the long-distance communications of on-location journalism. So, after a slight delay, or repress release, the university, pressed into the service of ghost busting, tested the documentation that had been collected now for almost 25 years. Now, I could quote endlessly from the stockpile of reports of real-life encounters with vampires. They always started with rumors that would circulate among the villagers about a particular dead person who was said to have returned. The officials would then go to the grave, dig up the corpse, and determine whether it had shown sufficiently advanced signs of decaying. If not, it was beheaded or burned or the heart was removed. There were countless investigations that went all the way to digging up suspects, and as the 18th century progressed, this preoccupation with vampirism gathered momentum and shifted into automatic. The rest, the remains of any old dead Freemason, Jew, or heathen were routinely disturbed and desecrated. There were also available at the same time countless extra measures that could be added to personalize your mourning ceremonies. Freud brought us the ambivalent take on mourning rituals. They reflect less our reverence for the deceased than our all-out fear of the dead. So if you had the slightest suspicion that your dearly departed was going to return as a bloodsucker, you would, after the corpse had been removed, remove the threshold of your house so that the zombie would no longer recognize it upon his return. Or the coffin could be carried out feet first so the corpse would not be able to watch, record, and play back the tape all the way back to the house. There were many how-to manuals that advised you, for example, to put stones in the mouth of the corpse to keep it from biting and gnawing itself first, then everyone else. Or sod could be placed over the corpse's torso up to the chin to keep it from eating itself up and out of the grave. Originally and always, the cross at the grave served the preventive, not the commemorative purpose. In the 18th century, Death or the dead got a new image. This period of secularization and return to classical models punctuated in a split of the second position the terminal closure of a Christian past suddenly too dark to follow or let in. In Germany, for example, Gotthold Ephraim Lessing wrote an influential essay on the way the ancients had represented death. He argued that the skeleton that had been the real popular image of death, the way to go, in Christianity, did not go beyond that immediate setting. The ancients represented death as the twin brother of sleep, as something attractive or just average, as being, like sleep, a natural. But at the same time, Lessing admitted an uncanny consequence of the doubling of sleep and death that had gone down without saying. The 18th century chose to naturalize death according to classical models. The ongoing allegorization of death that conceived life society-wide and graveside as a kind of terminal for waiting around for the better life to come was dropped into the unconscious. But in the meantime, up front, graves had to be relocated. No longer were the dead to be kept inside the polis. They had to be moved to the suburbs, again following the example of antiquity. In Paris alone, some 50,000 corpses had to be exhumed. In the course of this relocation or resettlement project, abundant evidence of premature burial was encountered. Now it was discovered that sleep had in fact been the double of death, and that on the other side of this doubling, many had awakened inside their graves to experience their own deaths the only way, it turns out, that is available, at once post-mortem and yet live. This is the primal scene or portrait of vampirism, the corpse with bloodied mouth and nails, whose contortions of clawing, of banging on the lid, of struggling to get out, complete the picture. Institutions of death watch and death certification were now required. The dread of premature burial inspired new and improved coffins fitted with gadgetry designed for those who just might find themselves too quickly buried and would require a means to signal their distress to those above ground. In Vienna in the 19th century, a specially designed morgue featured couches containing special metal plates and levers that could pick up the slightest movement in a body and transmit to a control room an electric bell-ringing signal that warned that there was still life left. Beginning in the 18th century, everyone wants one last outside chance to get out of the crypt, last call, even or especially for the dead. By the end of the 19th century, at the latest, the last will and testament regularly packed the proviso that the body not be buried until the heart had been pierced. With the dread of premature burial, one could no longer be certain that the dead were dead or dead enough. There emerged then, in our modern secular era, in the new cleaned-up place of death's representation, an uncontrollable blending of boundaries between life and death. Death was growing uncanny, unburiable, unframeable, unrepresentable, unmournable. I have to break for just a moment because my dog is going to throw up a chip that I fed her. Could I have some technical assistance here for a minute? I seem to have decapitated the microphone. Or is that everything I need? Oh, that's it? Okay. We have larger ones in Santa Barbara, old-fashioned ones. Okay. Good. Thank you. Was she okay? Because I had fed her a chip, and she was making suspicious noises. And I didn't know whether you really wanted to see her throwing up in my lap. Okay. Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau's Nosferatu was the first film in the genre to cast doubles of Stoker's novel to do the new medium stunts. Horror was seen first in films based on Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Even the film Murnau made right before Nosferatu was a Jekyll and Hyde movie titled Janus Face, which also counted as Bela Lugosi's first time in pictures. The earlier candidate for projection, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, is a story of doubling gone out of control because, by uncontrollable chance, it had been turned on not by the known formula, but by some foreign body, the unreconstructible ingredient in the potion or drug. The doubling trick was something that film kept turning, that kept film turning. Even the first Frankenstein film portrayed the monster as the double of Victor Frankenstein. Literature, which is where the phantasm of the double used to be at home, say in the 18th and 19th centuries, during the opening era of the uncanny, suddenly released the double and no longer featured it. At the same time, film and psychoanalysis were the two new institutions that began attending to the double feature. The phantasm of the double split to another medium, to the first techno-mass medium, and to a science of techno-media. Freud first addressed the double while attending the opening up of the soldier's psyche broken down by shell shock during World War I. Freud saw the incapacitating symptoms as referring to an internal conflict between two egos, the peace ego and its uncanny double, the war ego. Freud follows the splitting into a second system where they are renamed ego and superego. In the essay on the uncanny, which also follows the split Freud observed in symptomatizing soldiers, Freud refers to the self-observation or doubling of the ego as one of the sources of the uncanny. And he follows Otto Rank's lead and points out Stellan Rye's film, The Student of Prague, the primal screen of doubling, which was released just in time for the Great War, during which, for the first time, at least in theory, trauma was technologized and internalized as a force of replication. Narcissism was the final frontier Freud opened up through the inside viewing of the uncanny soldier psyche. The war showed Freud the way that traumatic wounding places the ego in double jeopardy by striking the register of narcissism or self-esteem, which gets reformatted in military terms as group morale and gadget love. The war shock of injury or loss that can contain itself only through symptom formation and repetition follows the dotted fault lines to the other shocking moment of intake, that of primal repression, which, Freud states universally, no one gets around, the instance of separation from the mother's body. The study of the double relation thus soon entered the science or institution of military psychology, ranging from absorption of shock on one side and infliction of shock on the other side via psychological warfare. As a cult relation, doubling was taken up by the societies of occult research, which expanded double time after World War I, motivated in large measure by the desire on the part of individual adherents or researchers to contact missing sons. Leaders of this expanding science or institution of occult studies contacted Freud on several occasions in the hope of setting up diplomatic relations and immunities between their respective efforts. At the same time, American and German film productions or projects sought collaboration with psychoanalysis, even on films in which psychoanalysis would be illustrated, and thus the new alliance between film and Freud science advertised. Freud said no, double no, but not because he did not believe in the close connections among all these media and mediums. Murnau entered the stage of theatricality and Oedipus pre-war through a break with his father, which he sealed with the name change to Murnau. Between the staging of a name change and his assumption of film directorial duties, there was his tour of duty in the Great War. A few months after his true love died on the Russian front, Murnau took to the skies of the new Air Force. There he discovered artificial flight as a new manner of perception tried and tested in the lab experiment of the new techno-war. Film alone could realize this motion through and across the image. Apparently, during his time as a POW in Switzerland, following landing his plane this side of neutrality, he began the groundwork for his post-war aerodynamic and cinematic POV by participating in propaganda filmmaking for the German side. Witness the vampire always rising up out of his secret crypt in centuries-long anticipation of the film medium, where the sense around of his unrepresentability fills the screen of doubling. Vampirism in Murnau's film makes ghost appearances as the ultimate double of the film medium. Most dramatically, you will have noticed, but always only when it is ready to cross over into the spirit realm, we see the film, at the same time revealed as medium, go out of control. We see Nosferatu's carriage lurching and jumping forward. We see the film reverse dark and light, negative and positive. The moving picture loses control. But once we get this jolt in the eye, we see better that we are crossing over into some unheard of, some unrepresentable realm, which is none other than that of the film medium. If we are reminded that this is a film, that someone has edited out shots to create that jumpy, lurching motion, and that someone has treated the film in the lab photochemically in order to reverse light and dark, then we are led to an inside view of the medium and vampire as occupying interchangeable places. So when the film reminds us that it is an artificial product put together in laboratories by editors and other technicians, the unrepresentable somehow gets represented. That is when the film seems to go out of control, the land of the phantoms comes into focus. Okay, now I'm jump cutting all the way to page 340. So many arguments will have gone unrepresented as we make this shift to my lectures on, the closing lectures on Rice's first three vampire novels. Remember how in Vampire and in many other texts that we talked about before, it was the father function, the dead father, the symbolic father, the guarantor of the law, of language, of abstract thought. It was this figure who kept our metabolism from shutting down, grief stuck. It was he who dislodged the corpses that we might otherwise hold on to, and by modeling substitution and mourning, kept us going, kept life going, kept a kind of desire going. But now, at the Nietzsche and Rice end of things, we find that it went all right, speeding toward a mass grave. The paternal order has reached a dead end, the end of Dad. Now, on the sidelines of paternal culture, and we have already become acquainted with this subculture, but we have talked about it in different terms, keeping to the terms of successful or unsuccessful mourning. Again, we find vampirism, but we find it affirmed by Rice as a place where an alternative may be coming soon. Now consider, around page 440, how vampirism comes into being according to the vampire mythology in the Vampire Lestat and in The Queen of the Damned, which fine-tunes and gives in stereo, via the twins, the prehistory and origin of vampirism that was first revealed in Lestat. The primal vampire parents, those who must be kept, started out as the mortal proponents of burial and preservation of dead bodies through mummification, which they introduced over and against the more primal corpse disposal system of cannibalistic funeral feasting. But already there was a division. One peaceful community governed by inside-out connections with spirits devoured their dead only. It was their communal sacred duty. The people of the Nile Valley, in contrast, were cannibals through and through, not only consuming their dead, but also hunting down their enemies for nourishment. The time came that it was the first time a king of the Nile Valley people had to marry outside the family and even outside his people to continue the royal line of descent, which was not only an incestuous one, but also the female kind, which, same difference, is the maternal one and only. This new bride from the outside introduces the ban on cannibalism of the dead or alive. The dead were to be embalmed and wrapped up as quickly as possible to keep their mourners from getting to the flesh. It was now to be believed that the preserved body was the deceased's ticket to a better life in the afterlife. Thus, the lack of consumption of the dead was not meant to represent disrespect, but rather infinite, that is, idealizing respect. Mummification puts the corpse up there and untouchable, out of reach of the death wishes that threaten its safekeeping. Spirits soon pose a problem to the new regime. Death wish management is at an all-time low. The royal couple is murdered, and their dying bodies are taken over by the hunger of spirits or demons, turned up full blast by mummification, by the interruption of the cannibalistic feast. These royals were the first techno-bodies. Vampirism comes about through the hunger of demons. Demons are on the loose. Demons have always been on the loose since the beginning of time, and they crave a body. That is what drives them. Demons craving a body, craving a pleasure that is perpetually denied them, invade the blood supplies, which thus become contaminated with a demonic hunger for the always missing direct bloodline to the body. Given all that we have said so far, we can also say that these demons are also always us. These demons are creatures of language without bodies, demons that are driven by a desire for a satisfaction they will never get. There we are. Vampirism achieves a pleasure that is purely intellectual, and this intellectual pleasure aims at that infinite pleasure obtainable through language's alliance with the imagination. On page 378, Marius defends speech, for example, as the greatest mortal gift, as a kind of model of the dark gift. What is lost as the demons enter the body is everything that otherwise makes up a body. What is fueled by the demon-run blood is the brain and the heart. That is how it is put. In this vampiric subculture, which seems more like a remake of our situation, or bringing to consciousness of our condition than it seems an alternative on lifestyle, still something is lost. The body is lost. That is quite clear in the discussion of the demon invasion. The body is left behind, but which body? It is the body as limit, which is not run up against, but crossed over. Vampirism thus seeks to obtain the greatest pleasure, the release of all pleasures, by erecting one law, it seems, and that law requires that incest be committed. This is the counter-law of vampirism, and it is aimed against the family. Our society, the defective paternal order, is held together by one law, the prohibition of incest. The vampiric counter-law commands incest. The body, your body, every body, is the maternal body. The body is the mother. By declaring the mother off limits, the body has been declared off limits, which is why it is the limit of pleasure. But vampirism, by making incest into the law, leaves behind the body as limit, the body as off limits. Once the ultimate requirement has been fulfilled, the injunction to get it over with already, a whole range of pleasure, where no bodily pleasure had gone before, is opened up by the alliance between the imagination and language, which inhibitions, trained or rehearsed on the body from early infancy on down inside the Oedipal family pack, have kept unconscious. That is why vampirism does not follow some policy issued beyond or before language of back to nature or back to the body. Once you have entered language, and we always do enter and will have entered language, there is no way back. There is no way the inevitable phrases and phases of our early development can be surmounted. Even though the infant does not speak, little one is spoken. That is one way the superego gets installed. The radical solution or satisfaction is to inhabit language's forced entry to the point of getting the most out of it, even maybe of getting around or beyond it, but from within. So how do you get as much pleasure as you can from being within language? You get beyond the body as limit or as off limits, and you achieve the deliberate, conscious reception of the truly pleasurable alliance, the one that comes between the imagination and language. That is what the vampiric kill is all about, and that is why, from our point of view, it translates into an affirmation of life and even of substitution beyond the longing for or the murder of a lost love. Akasha ends up the corpus she would not let the twins put to rest when she first severed their bond with the mediums or demons. Akasha created the myth of Osiris and Isis and the conveyor cult of exquisite mummies, the dual legacy of immortality and mass suicide, in order to package in some meaningful way the so-called dark gift, the power and the poison of ambivalence. Akasha became the undead mother, monstrously reanimated by the demon death wishes. It therefore is no accident that Akasha is turned into a vampire. She needs divine witness protection against admission of her own ambivalence. She just has to believe that her gods intervened to save her from the attacking demon and that they in turn divinized her. 6,000 years later, she is out to stake her claim as goddess over the condemned body of the impure or violent half of humanity. But even at its origin, vampirism, the instant it started replicating itself, produced a breed immune to Akasha's goodwill to meaning and power. Cayman, on whom Akasha performed the scientific experiment of her vampiric ability to confer her new status on others, passed his undeath on to the twins, who accepted the dark gift in order to counter or contain, in the slow time of inoculation, the unmourning becomes suicide drive that Akasha embodied. For 6,000 years, one twin, Maharet, who before becoming another vampire in order to contain the toxic spill at the origin of the vampire mummy, gave birth to a daughter named after the mother she and her twin sister had been kept from mourning. Thus she has reorganized humanity around the great family, her own ongoing allegiance to human living on through substitution and procreation and death. The family she raises out of her mortal bloodline grows interrelated and thus coextensive with mankind. So it is this family that Akasha threatens at its substitutive heart. Her non-violence is pure violence. To create absolute peace on earth, the contaminant that is violence must be removed. This desire for purity is the suicidal impulse, because pure violence, like non-violence, is the attempt to separate violence from life, and that is violence. Her ultimate wish is to get rid of death, but she cannot perform that service. All she can do is increase the dosage of death, as though thus controlling the factor of risk and randomness that is the hallmark of the other, of the future, of life. It is the sacrifice to end all sacrifice, the war to end all wars, all over and over again. But each attempt to bring violence full circle short-circuits and marks the origin of the greatest violence and the backfire of the most radical measures of violence control. But Akasha is destroyed, and the vampires survive the closing of her rule of vampiric transmissions. The twins perform the mourning ceremony and thus restore their blood, which flows through humanity, to the vampiric line, originally one of unmourning, now the other one of mourning work. The blood bond that linked all vampires to the demons inside Akasha was a one-way techno circuit. As Maharet explains, we are as receptors for the energy of this being as radios are receptors for the invisible waves that bring sound. Our bodies are no more than shells for this energy. A hard shell is made thus for linear time, the time that puts us on the line, the deadline, the one that lines us up into oppositions. Akasha rides out the invisible waves to the front line of total war, gender versus gender, mother versus father, blood drinker versus breeder. But the energy system Maharet describes might also be reconceived as a web of more circular kinds of connectedness. At the end, Maharet asks Akasha to give humans and unhumans alike the one thing she can give other than death. She cannot give life and cannot take death away. Why doesn't she give time rather than kill it? But she cannot give herself up to the randomness, the uncontrollability of the other. She can only give them the line about purity or mass destruction. But the stranglehold of linear time that has her on the line cuts her off too at the instant that it comes full circle with the twins. What we, vampires and non-vampires alike, are given at the end of the Queen of the Damned is time, nothing more or less. Certainly nothing changes. The violence that is life, that is in life, continues in Lestat's rule-busting power surges. So we are left with time, and that means with the relationship to the other, who is the future, the time that comes toward us. It is the time it takes to think or take pleasure in making imagination and words come together. The time it takes to come full circle, to heal, because that is the one time that one must take one's time to take the time it takes. It's the time of mourning, and now it's time. Okay, I wanted to read in closing just a small bit from Acting Out in Groups. It's a collection of essays by various authors that I edited, and obviously I'm only going to read from my own contribution. It's entitled Act Out, Turn On, the More Complete Aversion, and that refers punningly to this having appeared in Artforum, I think in '94, in a different version that had to be fixed up for various reasons, and I give some of those reasons around the revision here in the opening section that I'll read to you. It was like this. In the course of my work on Nazi psychoanalysis, I had uncovered, among many other closeted skeletons, certain determining conditions and contexts attending the invention of acting out, as the coverall designation it still is today, a label that advertises all the grief that an adolescent or the masses can give in terms of once and future psychopathology. These conditions were in fact in the beginning wartime conditionings. During World War II, analysis or analytic therapy was being mobilized on all sides of the total conflict to serve the psychological war and the psychic war economy. Group therapy was developed as the new and improved format for analytic treatment of war neurotics. After the war, this group model was recommended for treatment of sexual offenders. Thus, I had stumbled upon a collapse or collapsus of categories in the discourse of a certain institutionalization. The institution is that of greater psychoanalysis. In addition to original analysis, all the schools of therapy, even as they claim to move far away from the most basic principles of psychoanalysis, ultimately are stuck on their destination as forever part of Freud's science. Included in this part that keeps remaining greater than the whole of its diversifications and improvements were all the corridors of military psychology. I had just finished my Artforum interview with Kathy Acker, Bodybildung, in which certain value-free theorizations of acting out and group psychology were already along for the exchange for a change. Artforum at that time was hard-pressed to perform a balancing act around a rather, shall we say, conservative article by contributing editor Donald Cuspit that just could not be kept out of the magazine. My first version of a response addressed Cuspit's first version, which Artforum faxed to me before it had undergone any in-house copy editing. It was an eye-opener. I opened my response with a grammatological reflection on one of Cuspit's striking stylistic idiosyncrasies, which, technically agrammatical, represented and repressed a profound affinity with acting out. I was advised to drop that, if only because Cuspit's prose was always published in the magazine with the split infinitives edited out. But in the meantime, Cuspit had seen my first version. Apparently unaware that his prose undergoes correction before it meets the press, Cuspit had composed yet another response, or so I was informed, that, contrary to his wish, would not be added on as a chain reaction. I was reassured that I would not be needing to read Cuspit's latest effort, hot off the repression. But then, one day Artforum faxed an unsigned, untitled text to me, perhaps by accident. All this by way of identifying what follows as the original version of my response. But first I will begin with the outer corpus experience, with the piece of stray hostility that reached me by fax-ident. I give you the fax you message, intact and undisclosed. And here I quote the anonymous fax. Should I take Rickles' reflections on my text seriously? It's hard to do so. His text is long on rhetoric and innuendo, short on accuracy and understanding. He ought to be embarrassed by his grotesquely distorted account of the development of psychoanalysis and object relations. He hopes to drag me down, smear me along with them. His play with not-see and Nazi suggests as much. Perhaps the full measure of his mentality is his obsession with the typographical error that occurred in his text on Kathy Acker. Who's to blame? Me, the unconscious of the editors of Artforum, a virus lurking in the computer. Rickles has projective problems. The article on Acker is an apologetics for adolescent acting out. It's okay as long as it's literary. It's in defense of this privileging of the literary that Rickles attacks my unliterary text. There's a peculiar contradiction here. If, as Rickles says, acting out refers to dynamics internal to the analytic situation, what's it doing in literature, and why does he tolerate it there? Because he's one of the literati, and the literati feel threatened by the psychoanalysts who know more about the psyche than they do. Okay, now I have to play back the tape because there was a typo in the original fax. So if you read the sentence with the typo, it's as follows. Because he's one of the literati, and the literati feel threatened by the psychoanalysts who know no more about the psyche than they do. He, or whoever, doubled the no. Indeed, literature has always pretended to know more than it does, and Rickles wants to maintain the pretense. Acting out is not just a phenomenon of the clinical situation where it can be contained, but socially prevalent, and not just as an idiomatic phase or phrase of pop psychology or adolescence. It involves, at the least, the expulsion of primitive thoughts and the inability to tolerate frustration and splitting. As Bion suggests, it signals relational collapse, a general collapse of psychic linkage. In a sense, acting out is an ironical solution to splitting, to the dissociation of ideal and persecutory objects, for it provides a pseudo-link between them. As for my splitting of infinitives, I reunite them, strengthening their link by inserting a qualifying term between them. But why should I defend myself against a dupe of language like Rickles? Who is a shyster Derridian like Rickles, masking thoughtlessness by rhetorical manipulation to lay down the laws of language? He just acts it out, as his rhetoric suggests. End of anonymous facts. And I'm just going to read in closing the opening of the original version so you can see what someone was reacting against. In the last issue of Artforum, in the intro to my interview with Kathy Acker, the encounter with the midlife criticism of acting out I was already trying to have was at the same time a no-show. The very word encounter, in other words, had been elided, typo style, from its prescribed place between close and with adolescence. But in the evacuation of encounter from its sci-fi phrasing and teen phasing, a connection with today's assignment was nevertheless acted out, displaced with regard to the absence, loss, or deprivation to which it owes its omission. Acting out always catches on. Even its criticism, as in Cuspid's owner's manual to avant-garde acting out, is already stuck on it, right back down to the typographical level of the missing encounter, which is where, Golem style, the on-off switch operates. Cuspid's tendency to totally split infinitives, for example, already has the look of acting out, which doesn't stay put when Cuspid has it where he wants it and leaves it there. The split along the linguistic lifeline is a literal, anti-metaphorical way another split has of getting in your typeface, the one that's out there in the delinquent and deviant behaviors Cuspid identifies at the lineup with certain art practices. Okay, that's enough. Thanks. Ellie?
Yes, just a very general question. So, what was your personal trajectory to the vampire? How did you get there?
Through psychoanalysis, and Freud mentions the vampire once in passing in Totem and Taboo, where he develops a theory of projection there and in the Schreber case study, as you know. And it's in his theorizations of projection that Freud, in my reading, comes closest to identifying something that really is other than mourning. In the essay Mourning and Melancholia, one has a good sense of what mourning involves, but not a fabulous sense of melancholia's extremity. Now in Totem and Taboo, Freud talks about haunting, about how the ghosts of the dead return. And this seems to me the more compelling image within the whole corpus of what lies outside mourning work. So, in that section called The Taboo Upon the Dead, Freud, referring to a colleague, but nevertheless, suggests that all of our dead start out as vampires, because all of us have to do something, to whatever degree, with our mixed feelings towards the deceased loved one. And because they can't be admitted up close, at least not right away, we all to some degree tend to project, this is how he uses projection, to project those mixed feelings onto the dead, and that dead person is then reanimated by and with those wishes and is now a threat to us, or a vampire, as Freud says. So I had been interested in the vampire thus as an analogy in passing and in the background of Freud's work on mourning, or as I prefer to call it, unmourning. And so for this class, I attempted to reverse foreground and background in order to provide a kind of introduction to psychoanalysis that might somehow also draw in an audience. What's interesting, though, about this eventual success of the course is that it kind of demonstrates the vicissitudes, but also the determining force of the transference. Because when I started teaching the class, people would come, maybe 100 would come right away, and because of vampires. And then I would open my mouth and start talking about Freud, and we would have like 20 students. And that continued for maybe about 5 to 10 years, building slowly. Then I'd have 40, then 60 would stay. And then all of a sudden, through the 90s, I just filled every auditorium that I took. So first I hesitated, and there was an auditorium that seated 250, then the one that seated 500 that I think you saw for the most part. The last time around, the one that seated 1,000. So I'm not saying that they're all into it any longer, but something happened through this sort of growing of the in-group that made it more difficult for people to walk out on what I was doing. So it's kind of a success story regarding psychoanalysis and maybe the transference itself as the medium of pedagogy. Yeah?
As a sad anecdote, I was wondering if you happened to see the LA Times article on column 1 a few weeks ago, announcing that Freud's model of the unconscious was no longer relevant because scientifically it could be handled And the implication being, of course, that the unconscious has now formally disappeared into the diffuse atmosphere of cyberspace or genetic engineering. Very, very strange article, very long, about 3,000 or 4,000 words.
I saw it.
Featured one of the most bizarre cultural documents I've seen in the newspaper this year. So I suspect that you had some responses to it too.
Well, you know, my first response is that I remember how often this has happened. Do you too? It's almost like every 2 years, the front page announces the end of psychoanalysis.
It's so obvious. They said, well, penis envy isn't real. And my answer to that is, in 1898 to 1905, many, many women probably said to themselves, I can't leave the house on my own. I can't have my own bank account. I can't work. But if I had some sort of penis, so it's so obviously sociologically determined information and on, and to use him as a wedge.
But also to get stuck on details like that is a mode of resistance, as one knows in session when working with
we're in a culture that
analysts.
clearly, in a certain way, either wants to colonize the internal life that Freud tried to describe, or there's some sort of, was it the insurance companies? There's clearly a kind of anti-introspective phenomenon in our culture, or their culture, whatever you want to say. I'm sure you've witnessed and seen the examples yourself.
Right, but on the other hand, one would argue that the introspective momentum is increasing, if anything, in the mode of self-help, in the mode of codependency. I mean, California in particular is almost so much like Germany in the 18th century as a culture of interiority.
Oh yes, I mean, I think the sense of alienation and the obsessions with it are very fierce. There's something about the digital cyberculture, or whatever you want to call it, the larger economy, or maybe it's just what the HMOs are going to pay for. I don't know what it amounts to, but there is, I think it's like maybe the blur between public and private, which is phenomenological as well as physical, has something to do with this notion. Everyone has their favorite term for it. I call it the industrialization of desire. I'm sure you have 4 or 5 terms that you find interesting too. But it's a strange phenomenon to see the evaporation of the great 19th century constructions.
But I would be tempted to argue that all these diversifications of and around psychoanalysis that pretend to have left psychoanalysis behind, in other words, the various ways in which we cultivate our interiority today, the standards of therapeutic correctness that are very high in our culture, all of that still refers to Freud. So, I mean, there's a splitting going on here that has something to do with resistance. And, of course, that article came out at the same time as the Freud exhibit went up at the Skirball. Have you seen it?
No, I'm getting ready to see his chair and his couch at the Skirball.
Yes, well, that's worth it. I'm sorry, go on.
I'm just going to see whether it compares to Archie Bunker's chair at the Smithsonian.
Is it at the Smithsonian?
Yes.
That's great. But you'll see there, as you know, there was a lot of controversy around the show when it was even conceived. And so it was held up for 2 years. The curator claims that the show wasn't affected by this, but obviously when you walk in, you'll see that there are sort of epigraphs, flying quotes above each case, display case, representing current criticisms of psychoanalysis. And that is amazing that one could have imposed upon a historical documentation of a famous thinker this kind of corrective counterforce, as though it would be so dangerous otherwise. I mean, quite frankly, I could only imagine, say, a historical documentation of Hitler's life requiring that kind of, attention and precaution and caution. So it's very, very strange.
Readings of Deleuze and Guattari, which are not necessarily the debunking of the whole construction of interiority, but it's often misinterpreted that way.
Yeah, they have The exhibit has a quote from Derrida's speculations on Freud, out of context, as though he were criticizing Freud. But as you know, it's a very strong reading of Freud with Freud. So, I mean, the show is just, hostile isn't even the word for it. You'll see.
Please know the person who set up the show is going to have his own art school.
Yes, exactly. And we all...
It's Michael Roth, who was I guess he was second in command at the Research Institute part of Getty.
Yeah, except if you ask people at the Getty, no one knew what he did.
Well, that's outside of the purview of
Right.
doing vampire chronicles. We'll leave that alone.
But yes, now he's going to administer the arts and crafts school. Right.
I was just comment to the sort of corrective phrases that Mocha right now. There's an architecture show, and there's ample space and emphasis of Nazi architecture, and there are no corrective phrases.
Oh, really?
Nobody's bothering to explain.
Well, yeah.
It's very accepted. And
Yeah, it's okay to like that stuff.
It's only a building.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't seen that show. That is an interesting counterpart to the Skirball show.
Thank you, Larry.
Thank you. Oh, that's okay. They'll splice it in.
We're going to have some students applauding because it sounds like a phone.
Exactly.
Or 1,000. Yeah, I see this. You just push a special
It all
applause
ends
button.
with a close-up on her.
Oh, perfect. So she was okay?